Hello and welcome to Temporal, part of the podcast series with Ahval News Online. I am Yavuz Baydar, Editor-in-Chief with Ahval. Today, with a distinguished guest, we will discuss and analyze one of the fault lines in the increasingly volatile world politics and multipolar turmoil which shakes particularly the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean. Neither friend nor foe, this is the title of a brand new report which in-depth investigates the disarray between two historic allies within NATO and in the post-World War II in general, United States and Turkey. The report is written by one of the most prominent and consistent experts on Turkey and Turkish-American relations, Stephen Cook. As any Enrico Mattei Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies in Council on Foreign Relations, Cook followed and read into Turkey's wobbly, puzzling story for more than 2 decades. Welcome to Temporal, Stephen.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Pleasure is on our side. Let's, if we can, begin with the foreword by Richard Haas, just small parts of it. He writes like this in the foreword: "The time has come for the United States to rethink its approach toward Turkey. What we are witnessing is the gradual but steady demise of relationship. Turkey may be an ally in formal sense, but it is no partner, nor is it much of a democracy." And towards the end of his foreword, his conclusion is, or final thoughts are, while President Donald Trump has written that the recent release of an American pastor who had been detained by Turkey will lead to good, perhaps great relations between the United States and Turkey, such hopes are misplaced, he writes. Rather, as Stephen Cook explains, continues, as cooperation between the countries will be limited and contingent on specific circumstances, quote unquote. The strategic US-Turkey partnership is a thing of the past, at least so long as Recep Tayyip Erdogan governs the country. Recognition of that fact in Washington is necessary in order to pursue a more limited transactional relationship that better serves US interests. So let's take it from there. Can you tell us and walk us through about the recent report, which I think sheds light a lot on the drama that's happening between Ankara and Washington, D.C.
Well, yeah, I think it's very, very clear from Richard Haas's forward, and of course he can speak for himself, that the two of us see the relationship as having fundamentally changed over the almost 3 decades since the Cold War has ended. I think perhaps there's a slight difference between my analysis that's in the report and Richard's forward to the report, as is his right as the president of the Council on Foreign Relations to slightly disagree with what I had written. And he emphasizes that there's the possibility that relations can improve after the end of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's time in office, whenever that might be. I'm not entirely convinced of that. And the underlying theme of the report is that there has been so much structural change in international politics after the end of the Cold War, and the fact that the common threat of the Soviet Union no longer binds Turkey and the United States together. It has provided it has revealed, I should say, the different interests, the different priorities, and quite frankly, the divergent values between the United States and Turkey. And I don't think that those things are easily fixed. And it's perfectly understandable. I think a lot of Turks who've read the report have reacted poorly to it. But what essentially I'm saying is that Turkey is a big country with its own interests. Ankara is a very far distance from Washington, D.C., so naturally Americans and Turks think about problems in different kinds of ways, and that the Turks are pursuing their interests. What I am advising American policymakers is to be cognizant of that, is that Turks are pursuing their interests without regard for American interests. And that very often, because Turkey has these grandiose ambitions for being a regional leader, what Turkey is doing undermines American efforts, and that we should not be shy about opposing Turkey when it does that. Something we've done very, very little of in the past.
Okay, here with me also with us, İlhan Tanir, editor of English version edition of the Ahval News Online. İlhan, hello.
Hello there.
Take it from there. I think you have, I know that you have some questions.
There are so many questions. Thank you for coming on again, Stephen. We always learn so much from your report.
Well, thank you. I learned a lot from you too.
Thank you so much. There are so many questions, but let me start with one. Your 20-page report on Council on Foreign Relations, and everybody should read the report. Can you please try to draw a picture for us if the U.S. administration to follow your recommendations in a couple of years, let's say, Turkey continues to drift from the Western alliance? What kind of a Turkey should we imagine? Whether it's going to be the part of the East, shall we say, or you can maybe also add what kind of a democratic standards should we expect from such Turkey?
Well, I think the easier part of your question is the second one about democratic standards. And I think that what we have seen in Turkey over the course of at least the last decade is the dramatic deterioration of democratic standards. And I think that President Erdogan and the Justice and Development Party dominated parliament have essentially sealed Turkey's trajectory in a non-democratic way with a series of maneuvers that have secured for President Erdogan the executive presidency, which flows unprecedented power to the president, hollows out institutions that are supposed to be checks on the presidential power. Essentially, the parliament has handed over its own authority to the president, and this has manifested itself in a country that was once, I think, a promising candidate for EU membership, and transformed it into what has essentially become an elected autocracy. And I think that because of the nature of the institutions and the nature of laws and regulations and decrees, that it will, even if Erdogan voluntarily left office, if he was voted out, or if he passed away, I still think that these changes that the Justice and Development Party has made over the course of these many years will continue to affect Turkish politics over a longer period of time. Now,
do you see it as an irreversible force?
Nothing, I mean, forever is a long time and nothing is irreversible, but I think that we have to be realistic given how hard it is to actually change a country in one direction going in another direction. It's taken Erdogan almost 2 decades to do this. And the longer he's in power and the longer the Justice and Development Party is in power, the more opportunity they have to kind of embed Erdoganism into Turkish institutions and politics, making it that much more difficult to swing back in the other direction. You'll have to have a real kind of counter-revolution, so to speak, in order for that to happen. Now, back to İlhan's second question about, where will Turkey be? It's an interesting, and I write about it in the report, it's a kind of interesting tick on the part of analysts of Turkey, in particular Western analysts, but I'll consider İlhan a Western analyst given where he resides these days. A desire to put Turkey either in the East or the West, where my sense is that the kind of vast center of the Turkish public and Turkish leaders believe that Turkey needs to neither be East nor West, it just needs to be Turkey. That Turkey is a great power in its own right, has a long and glorious history going back through the Ottoman era and well before that, and that it doesn't need to be aligned with the East or the West. It just needs to be Turkey. I remember when I lived in Turkey in the early 2000s, a lot of young people, these were not people who were supporters of, this was before the AKP existed, not supporters of the Islamist camp or anything. They just said, we don't understand why we always have to choose to be whether we're in the West or the East. We're just Turkey. And I think that that's something that the Justice and Development Party has emphasized and then added to it this veneer of regional greatness, a leader of the Muslim world, a leader of Islamist movements, And that is where I think Turkey, in many ways, is. And I think that's the direction that it will be if we look down the road a couple of years.
One of the themes you are discussing in the paper is anti-Americanism, and certainly it's a big part of the Erdoganism in last decade, probably not in the first years, but
right.
Recent years. But many argue out there, many Turkey observers out there argue time to time that this is really no different than the anti-Americanism we have seen in the 60s or 70s under Ecevit, or the 90s some of the time. Do you agree that there is no difference now?
Well, I certainly am well aware that there's been a reservoir of anti-Americanism in Turkey for quite some time. But as I write in the report, it seems to have shifted into qualitatively in recent years under the Justice and Development Party. Some of that one can perfectly understand. The United States' alignment with the YPG, the People's Protection Units, the Syrian Kurdish Fighting Force, that is an extension of the PKK, is something that I think quite rightly outrages Turks. Their nightmare about a terrorist organization, a terrorist state, seems to be coming true, and it is being midwifed by the United States, which is purportedly a strategic ally of Turkey. So, one can genuinely understand that. What is beyond comprehension is the way in which the Turkish government and the Turkish press that is aligned with the Turkish government, which is most of the press, as you two well know, has engaged in the worst kind of anti-American conspiracy theorizing when it comes to, for example, the failed July 2016 coup d'etat, naming the commander CENTCOM, General Joseph Votel, accusing the CIA, accusing Henri Barkey, a professor of international relations at Lehigh University, that the United States was somehow involved, and that the United States is genuinely interested in regime change in Turkey, which is not the case. We would prefer not to be working with the YPG. We would prefer to be working with the Turkish army against ISIS, but the Turkish government decided that that wasn't a good thing. We had nothing to do with the coup d'etat. No one who's been named, or no one who Turkish officials have hinted at as being part of the coup, have any remote involvement of it. I'm separating Fethullah Gulen, but of course, when it comes to Gulen, who is a resident of the United States, the Turks haven't provided clear and convincing evidence to the U.S. government to warrant his extradition from the United States. If they did, I have every confidence that the United States would extradite Gulen, but his presence in the United States outrages many Turks. These things that are legitimate, the YPG, the unhappiness about Fethullah Gulen being in the United States, these things have then subsequently been manipulated by the Justice and Development Party for its political gain, to the point where you had millions of Turks who believed the United States was engaged in economic warfare against Turkey during the lira crisis, which is still going on, when that's really a function of Turkish economic mismanagement and the very unorthodox views of President Erdogan about what interest rates do and what they don't do. Yet he derives political benefit given that reservoir of anti-Americanism, and he's not held accountable for certain things as a result. But I will say, and I cautioned my friends during the presidential election last June, there was a lot of, I think, positive views of Erdogan's opponent, Muharrem İnce. But if you look very carefully at the things that Muharrem İnce was saying, or that he has said, and the CHP has said, or the MHP has said, not a lot of it has been very friendly towards the United States.
Okay, how pivotal is Turkey's drift towards Russia, with the Iran lurking in the background. I mean, Turkey being lost Turkey, etc. All this thing, this phrase we've been hearing so many times now. And also the concern in Washington, D.C. is very clear. How do we do this? How do we deal with this situation? At the end, it will, I think, boil down to Turkey. Will Turkey have to choose Russia, Eurasia path because of its need for alliance? How do you see that in the light of the report that you penned?
Well, I'm not sure that I agree that Turkey will need to make a choice. I think that at least President Erdogan himself is skillful enough where he is trying to make the most out of the multifaceted relationships that he has with the Russians, with the Europeans, with the Iranians, as well as with the United States. And he's had some luck in doing that, particularly at a moment of kind of maximal problems between Turkey and the United States. The Europeans not wanting to have Turkey's economic collapse on their doorstep have changed at least their rhetoric and their tone with Turkey. That's not to suggest that his visit in September to Germany was an all-out success. We know it wasn't, but the Europeans were actually less critical than they could have been over the course of the last few months. That there's something that has to do with President Trump, and again, has to do with not wanting to push the Turkish economy over the edge. When it comes to Russia, there's, I think, a number of motivations on the part of President Erdogan. First, if you want your interests looked after in Syria, unless you're going to completely do it yourself, the address to do that is the Kremlin. And that meant patching of ties with the Russians as best as possible. It also means, it also is a way in which the Turkish government demonstrates its independence of the United States. It's a stunning irony that the Russians have helped enable the killing of hundreds of thousands of Syrians, yet the Turkish press, the Erdogan-friendly press, has essentially given the Russians a pass. Yet the United States is taken to task for virtually everything. So it does say something about the quality of the relationship and the desire on the part of Turkey to have better relations with Russia. And when it comes to Iran, the Turks have long played, I think, a double game. Certainly there's economic exigencies. The purchase of gas from Iran is important, in part because no one wants to buy all of their gas from the Russians. But at the same time, the Turks were engaged in the largest sanctions evasion scheme in the history of sanctions in partnership with the Iranians. That is why there is a Turkish banker in jail in the United States for being part of this massive scheme. And this wasn't the only thing. This was the kind of culmination of Turkey seeking to outmaneuver the United States when it comes to Iran. If you remember the TRR deal, the Tehran reactor deal, which Turkey, Brazil, and Iran negotiated a separate nuclear accord outside the United States. Then they counseled, when Turkey sat on the UN Security Council, voted against sanctions on Iran, and then helped Iran evade those sanctions. Just recently, President Erdogan has railed against the re-imposition of sanctions on Iran. So Turkey seems to be wanting to play all of these different actors off of each other, doesn't want to be in one camp or the other, and seeks to benefit from them. That takes a lot of diplomatic and political skill. I will say, for the Russians in particular, it provides a great opportunity to weaken the bonds of the transatlantic relationship, given the fact that Turkey is a formal member of NATO. And I think Putin's strategy, whether he's really interested, and I think it's unlikely that they would ever have a strategic relationship with Turkey, but really Turkey as a means to sow weakness and division within the transatlantic alliance.
Let me pack my two big questions, final questions, into one for the sake of.
And I'll try to answer with a more economy of words, as we say.
Thanks so much. That is very enlightening already. About the human rights issues that you talk about, and also you talk about it, you discuss in the paper about the repressive nature of this current Turkish administration. Now that we passed the midterm elections here, now we have this democratic majority at the Congress in the House. What should we expect going forward, whether this democratic majority in the House will make any changes or make or urge Trump administration to do more on the human rights issues in Turkey? You are one of those Turkey experts. You talk about the human rights issues in Turkey a lot, whether on Twitter, social media, and in this paper. And this, my final question, I should add, we are expecting some important changing or turning points. Everybody is expecting what kind of a fine will be on Halkbank. Also, everybody is expecting whether the second indictment, not the whether, but when the second indictment as an extension of the Zarrab indictment will be out, or the U.S. relations, continuing relations with the YPG and all that. Given all this expectation, in the near term, let's say in 2019, what kind of a Turkey-U.S. relation should we expect?
I think contrary to some of the expectations that post the release of Pastor Brunson, that their relationship was going to improve, I think that those expectations are really getting out ahead of what's happening here. I think that it's true that the Trump administration is not really interested in the human rights situation in Turkey, but the Congress very much is, and that's on both sides of the aisle. It's a bipartisan issue. It used to be very much that Turkey had a long list of friends in the Congress. And over the course of the last 3-5 years, I really cannot think of too many of Turkey's friends, if it has any, in either chamber of either party. And I think that the Turkish government, its supporters in the United States, have to be concerned about the rumors that Defense Secretary Mattis will be departing the administration, because there has been, I think, significant thought on Capitol Hill given to how to get the Turkish government's attention through punitive actions for its human rights record, for a variety of other things. And it's been Mattis who has counseled Congress against that. I'm not convinced that another Secretary of Defense would be doing the same thing. The fact of the matter is that Congress is quite unhappy with Turkey. The executive branch is very divided on itself about how to proceed with Turkey. As to your other questions, I think the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York has made it clear that the investigation into Halkbank and other activity was not going to end with the sentencing of Mehmet Hakan Atilla. I think we should expect more indictments, and even in an environment where there's a new attorney general, those U.S. attorneys, especially the Southern District of New York, which is a historic position, is quite independent. So I expect more to happen on that front. As far as the Halkbank fine goes, I've been waiting for it just like you have. There's been no indication, and no one is saying a thing in Washington about how that's going to go down. I will say there was an expectation, given the way in which the Turks went about helping the Iranians evade sanctions and the magnitude of it. there was an expectation that the fines would be huge. I think with the release of Pastor Brunson and perhaps slight change in tone in the relationship, that may not be the case.
To end our conversation, because we are running out of time, Stephen,
yes.
To sum up, you had some recommendations at the end of your report about how to perhaps, let's say, save the relationship between Turkey and the United States. Just give us those 4 recommendations to sum up, and let's finish up there.
Sure. In fact, what I say is let's not think about saving the relationship. I think that puts us in a bad place in faulty analysis. Let's recognize, one of the recommendations is let's recognize that this relationship has changed. And as a result, we have to expect less and ask for less. To the concrete things that I suggest, we need to develop alternatives to Incirlik Air Base. That doesn't mean abandoning Incirlik, but it means that if we have alternatives, be it in Greece, in Romania, on Cyprus, perhaps Jordan, perhaps Iraq, we wouldn't be vulnerable to blackmail from the Turkish government. From time to time, Turkish leaders say, we're going to cut off American access to Incirlik. I think the second recommendation is for the United States not to give up the YPG, not to give in to Turkish demands. That's a tough thing to say. Because neither the YPG nor the PYD represent all Syrian Kurds. I recognize that there's significant problems with these organizations. I recognize that the YPG is part of the PKK, but we have no other partner there. We cannot finish the mission without the YPG. The third thing is we need to reassess and reevaluate Turkey's participation in the F-35 program. You cannot buy high-tech Russian equipment. You cannot imprison Americans. You cannot rail against the American government. You cannot help Iran evade sanctions. You cannot threaten American soldiers. You cannot try to complicate American efforts in Syria and then expect the United States to be willing to allow you to have the F-35, even if you are part of the consortium building it. It doesn't make any sense. And then finally, I think it's very important for, if not the Trump administration, and members of Congress to speak out strongly about the human rights violations going on in Turkey, which are extraordinary. Turkey is the leading jailer of journalists in the world. There are tens of thousands of Turks that have been jailed on spurious charges. We don't think about it in this way, but Turkey is among the most repressive countries in its immediate neighborhood.
İlhan, any other questions?
That's all. This was a great and very insightful conversation to reflect what's going on in Turkey and report as well. Everybody should read it.
Well, thanks so much for that endorsement of it from both of you. And it's always a pleasure to be on. And I'm sorry I ran on a little bit long.
Our guest was Stephen Cook, Enrico Mattei, Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies with Council on Foreign Relations, writer of the most recent discussed report already, titled Neither Friend Nor Foe, about Turkish-American relations and its future. Most enlightening thoughts, Stephen. Again, thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Take care.